Good afternoon, and welcome to our first webinar of 2026. My name is Jackie Baxley, and I'm with HRP, and I'll be leading us through our content today on ISO 14001. Are you ready for the 2026 updated standard of ISO 14001? Before we get started, just to point out a few functionalities, if you will, everybody's just in listening only mode for this webinar. So if you have a question, please use the question toolbar that you'll see on the webinar platform, and we'll take some time at the end of the webinar to review those questions. Also, at the end of the webinar, you'll have my direct contact information. So if you have a question that is a little too nuanced for you to type into the question and answer toolbar, feel free to give me a call and we can talk through those nuances. I will be sending out a copy of these slides after the webinar, so you can expect to receive a copy of these slides following our broadcast. So with those preliminary details out of the way, this webinar is being brought to you by HRP. Since 1982, HRP has been working with our clients and stakeholders to assure that they move their environment forward. What we mean by this is we work to minimize the environmental and compliance risk associated with our clients' projects and help them reach their business goals. We're a multidisciplinary environmental compliance and engineering consulting company with several offices across the country. And sandwiched right into these services that we provide are those sustainable compliance programs, such as those supported by ISO 14001. Now, as I mentioned, I'm Jackie Baxley. I'm the Environmental Health and Safety and Sustainability Practice Leader for HRP. I have a professional engineering certification in several states, and I've been working within management systems for over 25 years. So I started my career in industry. So I started my career in having to develop an ISO 14001 program for our location, for our site, within a larger umbrella certification within our company. So I've actually been working in the ISO 14001 standard since its very first edition in 1996. Across my professional career, I've kind of grown and evolved with this ISO standard. And so I'm happy to share with you what we're anticipating for this latest revision of ISO 14001. So what we're going to cover today in our webinar, I'm going to give just a very brief ISO concepts refresher. In case anybody is kind of new to ISO 14001, this very brief refresher will hopefully help to make sure that everybody's at least on the same platform before we start to talk about what we are anticipating for the 2026 revisions. And I want to highlight anticipating for the 2026 revisions. The final standard has not yet been published, but in following articles and talking heads and webinars, we have a pretty good idea of what to expect in this upcoming standard. And so we'll give you a little sneak peek of what to expect and then looking ahead, how you can use your time wisely to update your management system to the 2026 standard. So starting briefly with a refresher of just some basic ISO 14001 and basic management system concepts. So the major management system principle is this platform called Plan, Do, Check, Act. So this management style, just as it kind of shows here on the graphic, is a constant cycle. So you are always within a management system, somewhere in your planning actions, somewhere in your doing actions, somewhere in your checking to make sure you're doing what you said you're going to do and that it's working, and somewhere within the acting element, where if you find those issues of nonconformity or noncompliance, you're acting to improve your system, which just kind of catapults you right back into that plan, do, check, act cycle. Now, ISO 14001 is the environmental management system standard. Some of you on the call might have other management systems. Some of you might have a quality management system relative to ISO 9000 or similar industrial specific standards. Some of you might have ISO 45001, which is the health and safety management system. Today, we're just talking about ISO 14001, which is the environmental management system standard. And if we look at just the way the ISO 14001 standard is structured today, you have a few informative and introductory sections within the standard. We call these clauses instead of chapters. Sometimes you'll see some terms and definitions and references within the ISO standard that is not really indicative of maybe how we speak or our lingo in the United States. And it's important to remember this is an international standard. So some of the terms are very intentionally selected just to make sure that they actually translate across all member countries of ISO because these are international standards. So that the normative references, the terms and definitions in those first few, again, we call them clauses instead of chapters, are really important just to make sure we understand the text. And then clauses 4 through 10, this highlights the requirements of ISO 14001. And ISO 14001 is very tailorable to different types of businesses and organizations. It's tailorable whether you're in manufacturing, whether you're a service provider, whether you're in higher ed. I've seen ISO 14001 applied to a wide variety of businesses with a wide variety of sizes and footprints. And so these requirements in clause 4 through 10 are really high level so that you can tailor them to your unique situation. But if you're ever seeking ISO 14001 certification or you're seeking to maintain that certification, clauses 4 through 10 is what you must conform with to have a certified system. And then at the end of the written ISO standard are some annexes. We might call these appendices or attachments, but these annexes are just additional guidance information. It's important to note if you're seeking certification or recertification, or you're just going through a surveillance audit of your ISO 14001 environmental management system, the information in these annexes is not auditable. And what that means is the information here in these annexes is additional information for you, the reader of the standard, to understand what they're speaking to in these clauses, maybe to give you some examples so that you can better tailor this ISO platform to your organization. So with the 2026 standard update that we're about to get into, really pay attention to these annexes. I'm really expecting a lot of additional guidance text in Annex A. So don't just read clauses 4 through 10 when this new standard is published. Spend a lot of time in understanding the guidance as well, just to help calibrate you and give you those examples and give you a little bit more flavor, if you will, of how to apply this standard to your organization. All right, now I'm a visual person. So I like to always take these kind of high concept ideas like an ISO standard and put it into some type of visual system. And so if we look at ISO 14001 from a visual perspective, the very first step is to identify what do you hope to achieve with this management system? So what are your intended outcomes? Once you know what you hope to achieve with the environmental management system, the standard prompts us to identify what are the internal, so internal to our organization, and external to our organization issues that are either going to help us meet these intended outcomes or are going to get in the way of us being able to meet these intended outcomes. And then we also take into account who are our interested parties. You might be more familiar with the term stakeholders and interested parties, similar terms here. But who are stakeholders or who are interested parties? And what are their needs and expectations of our organization? And those concepts, what we intend to achieve, what's going to help or what's going to get in the way, and what are other things that other folks out there are going to expect of us, that builds what we call the context of the organization, which is clause 4 of the ISO standard. And once we have this high level conceptual understanding of the concept of our organization, we're then able to identify the scope of our environmental management system. And once we've identified the scope of our environmental management system, that's the fence line of our management system. Those are the guardrails, if you will. And it's everything inside the scope that we're then going to exercise that plan, do, check, act cycle in managing those environmental issues. So that's a little pictorial representation of what ISO 14001 prompts us to do relative to controlling environmental topics. So with this high level understanding, let's hop into what we're anticipating for the 2026 revision of ISO 14001. So what you see here is a rough timeline. So we are currently operating under the ISO 14001 2015 revision. So that is the most recent standard is 2015 standard. And ISO standards are typically reviewed every 5 years. And in this review, ISO is looking to determine is a revision necessary or just confirm that it's still adequate. Or they withdraw the standard because they decide that controlling of that particular topic is no longer necessary. So in the last review for the ISO 14001 2015 standard, it was identified, okay, we need to make some amendments. And so we had a bit of what I like to call kind of an interim update in 2024. And in 2024, an amendment, not a full-on revision like we're expecting for 2026, but an amendment was published just voicing that the users of the standard needed to take into consideration issues regarding climate change, specifically in the context of the organization. So that amendment has been on the book. So those of you that are currently certified to ISO 14001, you probably had to review your context of your organization a year or so ago. Make sure that you were taking into account climate change. And if that was an internal, external issue, you were working it through your system. Or if your interested parties had expectations of you relative to climate change, you were working that through your system. So that amendment that was published in 2024 is now integrated into this final updated standard that we're anticipating later. I was about to say later this month, but it's still March. We're anticipating it next month in April. So the draft standard, so the draft international standard that will become ISO 14001 2026 revision was drafted last summer. And just like any regulation or standard or rule change, it goes through a series of reviews. And there was a final standard that was then put to the voting parties earlier this year in January. So the voting members of ISO have in their hands this final draft standard. They have voted on that standard to adopt it. And so what we are doing right now is we're just waiting for that final standard to be published. And then once it's published, then we'll know exactly what the updates are, and we'll know exactly how we need to proceed to maintain our certification or to gain certification if that's something that you're looking for. So we are expecting the standard to be published by the end of April. I've seen some publication dates more along the lines of the middle of April, but we are anticipating this to be published in April. We are also anticipating that there is going to be a 3-year transition deadline. And so what that means is if, here we are in 2026, if you're about to have your certifying body come through and certify you in May, let's say, recertify you in May, you do not have to be conforming to this 2026 standard in May for that next recertification. But you will need to be certified to this new standard prior to the, again, if it's published in April of this year, and if it is a 3-year transition date, then you would need to update your certification to the 2026 standard by April of 2029. So that's what we're expecting. Once it's published, we'll have hard and fast numbers, but that is what we are expecting. Now, changes have been deemed as moderate. And so what that means is those organizations with certified systems will likely not experience a heavy lift to conform with this new updated standard. But what I'm going to go through now is just what we are anticipating relative to the ISO standard. So what do we mean by moderate changes? What do those moderate changes currently look like? Before we get into those, what we're anticipating for those moderate changes, it's important to understand kind of why these are being revised. So remember I said ISO reviews their standards every 5 years. And when they're reviewing those standards, they're making sure that they're still adequate, appropriate in scale and nature relative to whatever it is that standard is trying to manage. And our knowledge of sustainability factors, our knowledge of the environment continues to grow and evolve. So it only makes sense that the standard would continue to grow and evolve. So the reasoning behind this revision reflects current global environmental priorities as well as environmental pressures. It strengthens management of change. It strengthens supply chain oversight, and it expands the scope of your environmental management system with a life cycle perspective. So we'll talk about what this means as we go kind of clause by clause. But if I was to put one word behind the reason for this 2026 standard, that one word would be sustainability. That one word would be looped into that very first bullet. The current global environmental priorities, the current global environmental pressures. Anybody out there that has a sustainability program knows that all of these bullets are reflected in a strong sustainability program as well. All right, so going clause by clause. Remember, clauses are our chapters. Clauses 4 through 10 are the requirements. So highlighting what we're expecting relative to these requirements. As we look at the context of the organization in clause 4, we're expecting some additional text in clause 4.1, understanding the organization and its context. 4.2, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, and potentially some updates to one's scope in 4.3, determining the scope of the environmental management system. So if we drill into these, currently clause 4.1 reads, the organization shall determine external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and that affect its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of its environmental management system. Such issues shall include environmental conditions being affected by or capable of affecting the organization. So think back to that pictorial representation I mentioned a moment ago. What do we hope to achieve? What are our intended outcomes? And what internal or external issues are going to support our meeting those outcomes or get in the way? So with that 2024 revision that I mentioned, it added a note that you needed to take into consideration climate change. It didn't say that climate change was going to be an issue for you. It just said you need to at least ask the question, is climate change an internal or external issue for you? And for some of us, it probably was not. And for a lot of us, it probably was. So now we are expecting text to be added to this clause that reads something along the lines of, the organization shall determine whether environmental conditions are relevant issues, including climate change, so that's feeding in that 2024 revision, as well as pollution, biodiversity, natural resource availability, and ecosystem health. So remember, one of those kind of driving reasons behind updating the management system was that life cycle perspective across our scope. So as we look at things like natural resource availability, we look at the price of oil right now. Those are all things that could be internal or likely more external issues that are going to maybe limit our ability to meet our intended outcomes. So this update is just prompting the user of the standard to ask the question, are these environmental conditions, specifically climate change, pollution, biodiversity, natural resource availability, and ecosystem health, specifically issues to our organization? I would say this has always been implied in the standard, and I would say this has always kind of been implied if you looked at the guidance, but they're just putting it right in front of our face now that we need to take these into consideration. Under clause 4.2, which is understanding the needs and expectations of our interested parties, the standard has always prompted the user to identify who are their interested parties, what are their needs and expectations, and which of those needs and expectations was the organization going to adopt as a compliance obligation. And then by adopting as a compliance obligation, that moves through our management system in that plan, do, check, act cycle. So in the 2024 revision, there was a note that was added that the user of the standard need to recognize that interested parties could have needs and expectations around climate change. So now they're just augmenting it, very similar to clause 4.1 we just looked at here with 4.2. We're augmenting it to additional environmental conditions beyond just climate change. So relevant interested parties can have requirements related to climate change, as well as other environmental perspectives, such as what we just talked about in clause 4.1, biodiversity loss, availability of natural resources, pollution, and so on. So we just need to recognize that our interested parties may have those. And any of you that supply, within the manufacturing supply chain, you're probably already seeing these pressures from some of your customers. We're a service provider, and we're seeing these pressures from some of our clients, where they want us to report our greenhouse gas emissions because climate change is a need and expectation of our clients. So we monitor and track and report on our scope 1 and 2 emissions, and we're embarking on scope 3 now. So those of you that are in those conversations with your customers, you're probably already seeing these pressures. And if you're not, just recognize that these pressures could be coming down the pipe. Now, 4.3 is the part of the ISO standard that prompts you to define the scope of your environmental management system. And what we're anticipating with this 2026 revision is increased references to using a life cycle perspective. We've already seen that in ISO 14001. If you read through the standard today, you'll still see that life cycle perspective. But there is, I would say, I'm anticipating a higher degree of scrutiny relative to that life cycle perspective. I'm expecting increased references to using the life cycle perspective that prevents adverse environmental impacts from being shifted elsewhere within the life cycle. Instead of just simply saying, oh, well, I can't control what my people in my supply chain do. You really need to look at that with a critical eye. Can you manage your supply chain? Can you influence your supply chain? Can you control your supply chain? And just look across the entire life cycle of your product, activity, or service. And the typical life cycle stages are design, procurement, transportation, production, and then transportation of the finished good, the use of that good, and then the ultimate end of life or disposal of that good. So some of you are going to have actions along this life cycle. Some of you are not going to have actions along this life cycle. If I just use HRP as an example, under that production part, it is a service that we provide. It is sometimes an activity that we provide. We don't manufacture a part or any type of widget. And so there's normally not that use or end of life. So those would be NA for like a service provider. But it could be very applicable if you are in the traditional manufacturing space and you're having to look at end of life. And is there something that you can do at the design phase that limits the environmental impact at that disposal phase, for example? So I'm just anticipating scope scrutiny relative to what can you truly manage, influence, or control within the life cycle of your activity, product, and service. As we've been helping organizations develop ISO systems, we're just being very transparent about it. And we're saying, what is the design aspect? Who has control of it? Who has the ability to influence? Who has the ability to manage? And if it's out of our control, then we're stating that clearly so that we can support the scope of our management system. So again, if we look at just this pictorial representation, the context of the organization really helps to define our scope. And then now we know that our scope really needs to take into account that life cycle perspective. So what are the intended outcomes of our management system across that life cycle perspective? What's the internal and external issues? What are the needs and expectations of the interested party? And all of that is going to potentially, depending on your organization, tweak the context of your organization, tweak the definition of your scope. And if those get tweaked at all, those are foundational aspects of your management system. So it then might carry through with your plan, do, check, act. For some organizations, we might not see any change here. For other organizations, we might see some additional elements threading through our management system. So clause 5, the next clause, is leadership. And we're expecting some moderate revisions in clause 5 relative to leadership, specifically under clause 5.1, which is leadership and commitment. We're seeing an emphasis on ethical leadership. I would say that was always implied in the standard, but it's going to be voiced a little stronger, whether that's going to be through notes or whether that's going to be through guidance and annex. We are expecting an emphasis on ethical leadership. We are expecting leadership having to support all relevant roles involved in the management system. If you recall in clause 5.1, as it's currently written, leadership is support management roles involved in the management system. So this is expanded to all roles within the management system, not just those in that management level. We're expecting reinforcement of full accountability. I would say the standard has always, I think, been clear that accountability lies with top management, but top management has the ability to delegate. Top management still has the ability to delegate, but it appears that the standard is reinforcing that accountability starts and stops with top management. And then it's also voicing that leadership has a more visible role in embedding sustainability principles into the operation. I've worked with a lot of environmental management systems over the years, whether it was my own management system when I worked in industry or whether at HRP where we're helping folks with theirs. And I've seen a lot of environmental management systems that were really kind of compliance driven. And so with this 2026 standard, if there's anybody out there who your management system is kind of compliance driven, if there's not a regulation out there, then it's something that you have kind of scaled out maybe of your management system. Here's just yet another place within the standard where it's embedding sustainability principles into the operation. So beyond compliance. 5.2 is our environmental policy. Most will not need to change their policy, but all should review the policy for continued suitability to this new standard. What we're anticipating are small tweaks here. We're anticipating tweaks in some of the standard language that might be a little stronger terminology. For example, some of the draft standards that I got my hands on. It replaces meet obligations with fulfill obligations. So just a little stronger to meet versus fulfill. So we're expecting some stronger terminology like that. We're also expecting inclusion of broader environmental and sustainable principles. So if, as you're looking at your management system, if you have some of those environmental conditions that you now need to take into consideration in clause 4 that you have identified is an issue relevant to your organization or is an expectation relevant to your stakeholders, then that might prompt you to tweak some of the language within your policy. Or maybe you've augmented your scope somewhat as a result of taking a critical eye to that life cycle perspective. That might prompt you to maybe add another sentence to your policy. So again, not expecting huge changes here, but everybody should absolutely review your policy for continued suitability relative to the pending 2026 standard. Going next to clause 6, which is our planning clause. So if you remember the management system principle of plan, do, check, act, clause 6 is what prompts that planning. And I'll be honest with you, I've been working in this standard since the very first revision of the standard, and I've always been, not confused, but always from my organizational mind was not loving how clause 6.1 was organized. Clause 6.1.1, the general standard, I always thought needed to come after aspects and compliance obligations because it was kind of talking about those before it really got to the standard. So apparently I was not the only one that thought clause 6.1 was organized a little wonky, because with the 2026 standard, we are expecting some organizational changes here, not significant action changes, just organizational changes. So if you too always were kind of wondering why the general standard in clause 6.1.1 came before all of the references it made to aspects and obligations, you too might be happy to see that it is getting moved. So clause 6.1.1, those requirements relative to the risk and opportunities are moving to clause 6.1.4, which moves the historical clause 6.1.4 planning action to clause 6.1.5. So just some housekeeping, I would say, there in clause 6.1. No, we're not anticipating any significant changes or any changes at all to objectives and plans to achieve them. But there is a new addition to the standard, and that is change management. So let's drill into these a little bit more. So on the clause 6.1, clause 6.1 has always said in clause 6.1.1 that you need to identify the risk and opportunities from your aspects, from your compliance obligations, and from the context of your organization. So none of this has changed. It's just moved from the beginning of that clause to the end of that clause, which makes a little bit more sense. Let's identify our aspects. Let's identify our compliance obligations. Let's identify the context of the organization from clause 4 before we get to the risk and opportunities. So it's just organized a little better now, in theory. Now, clause 6.3, this is where I anticipate probably the most heartburn for some organizations. In my 25 plus year career, management of change is something that I kind of uniformly see organizations struggle with. A lot of organizations might have a management of change program, but it's rarely implemented. It's implemented after the fact a lot of times. And management of change has always been baked into the ISO 14001 standard, but it was just implied throughout the standard. Now, it is coming out as its own clause, 6.3 change management. So no longer is it implied. You're actually going to need to establish a planned, structured approach in managing environmental change. And this planned, structured approach is going to need to address compliance obligation changes, so like a reg change, operational adjustments. This is what I see elude a lot of our clients. What you might not recognize as an operational adjustment could be a significant operational adjustment. For example, increasing the speed through a production line could be the difference of needing an air permit or not. Adjusting a supplier could be the difference in a reporting obligation or not relative to like EPCRA or Tier 2 or something along those lines. So this program needs to address compliance obligation changes, operational adjustments, mergers, acquisitions, joint ventures, technological or process shifts, such as maybe AI, and then business disruptions due to supply chain issues, labor disputes, natural disaster, regime change, and political unrest or war. So this last bullet kind of strikes a chord right now as you look at our current geopolitical climate. This is going to be, I think, the biggest lift for any organization that does not already have a detailed and implemented management of change program. Any of you out there that is also ISO 45001 certified, which is the health and safety standard, ISO 45001 for occupational health and safety has always had its own section relative to change management. So if any of you have integrated systems of ISO 14001 with 45001, you're going to be in a much better space relative to adjusting to this update. Clause 7 is our support clause, and I kind of like to think of this as the grease for the wheel of that plan, do, check, act. You can't plan, do, check, act without resources, without competency, without awareness, communication, and documented information. So this is our support clause, which really drives the movement of that plan, do, check, act cycle. We're not anticipating any significant changes here. Clause 8. Some changes here in Clause 8, and mainly just because of the building of the other changes throughout the management system. And what I mean by that is operational controls might need to be strengthened to reflect your supply chain sustainability or your life cycle perspective. So if you are implementing some controls or some influence techniques across that life cycle, across that supply chain, then you're going to see those controls here in Clause 8.1. So in our plan, do, check, act, Clause 8, that's our doing. This is what we're doing to control what we need to control that we identified in our planning steps. So some could see just additional controls because of the supply chain and life cycle perspective. Now, if you're not seeing any additional controls from those perspectives, you might see some additional controls because what used to read in Clause 8.1 that you had to control outsourced processes, they've replaced that text with you're going to need to control externally provided processes, products, and services. So this is broadening the language. This is clarifying what was always intended for outsourced processes, but they're putting a finer point here, and they're defining that, externally provided process, products, and services, are those used by the organization, but supplied by others outside of the organization. Or an external provider means an external supplier organization, including a contractor that processes a product or a service. So this might bring in some additional controls if, for example, if you're in some types of parts manufacturing and you're sending that part off-site to be plated and then it comes back into your process. Well, that's an externally provided process. And so with your life cycle perspective and your supply chain, you're going to need to look at those externally provided process, products, and services and place controls on those as appropriate within your manufacturing and within your management system. So again, just a little bit more robust language is how I would define what we're seeing here in Clause 8. And I'll also say, if I go back to Clause 8 for a minute, this also better aligns with ISO 45001, which is, again, the Occupational Safety and Health Management System standard. If you are also ISO 45001, there's always been more robust controls for contractors and suppliers and those outsourced processed. So those of you that are listening in that also have ISO 45001, you're probably going to be a little bit better equipped here. You'll just need to look at these controls across the life cycle as appropriate, not just within the safety and health arena. Clause 9, moderate, minor changes here, anticipating stronger language around information requirements for internal audits. We're seeing some language where it's always said consideration of replaced with the word shall. And those of you that have operated within ISO management system requirements know the word shall is an obligation. Thou shalt is how you can kind of read shall. So we're expecting a little stronger language relative to some of the documentation and implementation of your internal audits. Nothing that I would anticipate totally changing your program, but maybe tweaking some of that documentation associated with your internal audits. And on management review, just administrative. If you've ever read through, or if you've read through clause 9.3 recently, it starts off with, what are the inputs for your management review, and then what are the outputs of your management review. What they've done is they've carved those up into additional subclauses. So if you read management review in the anticipated 2026 standard, what you're going to see is clause 9.3.1 is management review inputs, and not clause 9.3.2 is management review outputs. So nothing really different there, just some housekeeping, if you will, of how it's organized. And the last clause, clause 10, this is also one that I've always had a little bit of heartburn with. I've always kind of struggled on what's the difference in clause 10.1 and 10.3. If you read through those, they're kind of similar. So that's one that I've, over my career, have had to really kind of wrap my head around. And again, apparently I was not the only one, because they are now merging clause 10.1 and 10.3 into one clause. So now under clause 10, again, just kind of a housekeeping thing, nothing that's going to be substantially different here other than you're still going to have clause 10.2 with the nonconformity and corrective action, and that continual improvement and the language within the general clause is all going to be smashed into one clause 10.1. So just organizational changes there. So high level, that's what we're anticipating for the 2026 standard. Again, we are anticipating that standard to be published by the end of April. Right before this webinar, I just went to all of my sites that I like to review, and still anticipating that it's going to be published by the end of April. So we're currently in the situation where time is on our side. So if time is on our side, let's look ahead and see how can we use that time wisely. So if you are currently certified to ISO 14001, the 2015 standard, which is the current standard, start a timeline conversation with your registering body. Your registering body should be a partner to you and your management system. You have a relationship with your registering body. Some call it a certifying body, some call it a registering body, but this is the organization that has issued you your certificate that you are ISO 14001 certified. And you have a relationship with this organization because they did your initial certification. At the 3-year mark, they do your recertification audit, and each year in between, they're doing your surveillance audit. So you should have a relationship with this organization. So knowing that the 2026 standard is about to be published, just go ahead and plan out a timeline with them. I was working with one of our clients here recently, and they are about as much in the sweet spot as you can possibly be. They are looking at recertifying to the 2015 standard in April. So they're almost going to have that whole 3 years to transition. So we've kind of worked with them and their certifying body for a timeline where the certifying body is going to, with the surveillance audits, is going to to work with them to be like, yes, if this is what you're doing for clause, 4 now, yes, that appears to conform. So they're really using taking it in bites, if you will, to use that whole time to their advantage. But go ahead and start brainstorming if you have internal or external issues that are going to be appropriate to your management system as it relates to climate change, pollution, biodiversity, natural resource availability, and ecosystem health. Ask, who are your stakeholders? Who are those interested parties? And do they have expectations associated with climate change, pollution, biodiversity, natural resource availability, and ecosystem health? And again, just a couple of examples here, right? Are you in an area that is prone to flooding? And is that flooding increasing over time as we experience wilder weather patterns in certain areas? And that increased flooding, is that impacting your ability to, maybe manage your stormwater permit, or maybe there are certain areas of your plant you just can't get to after a rain? Does that impact your ability to meet those intended outcomes? If so, then you might want to make sure that you are identifying that as an external issue. And then the next step in your management system, as you look at what used to be clause 6.1.1, is now going to be clause 6.1.4, taking that to the next step, you then identify, okay, do I need to address this as a risk or an opportunity within my management system? So consideration is the first step. Consider it. If it's an issue, then you want to recognize it as an issue. And then, is it an issue you need to address? That will be presented in the new clause 6.1.4 under risk and opportunities. But go ahead and brainstorm those so that you're ready for that activity and that exercise. And start documenting whether you're in the business of producing a product, exercising an activity, or providing a service. Start to document what is your life cycle of your product, activity, and service. And specifically across that life cycle, do you have the ability to manage that aspect of the life cycle? Do you have the ability to influence that portion of the life cycle? Do you have the ability to control that portion of the life cycle? Or does that part of the life cycle even apply to you? Remember, it's design, it's procurement, it's transportation, it's the production of the product, activity, or service, and then the transportation on the back end, and the use on the back end, and the disposal on the back end. Maybe you can't control it, maybe you can't manage it, but maybe you can influence it by adding some terms and conditions to your purchase order on the procurement side, or something along those lines. So go ahead and start again documenting what is your life cycle for your product, activity, and service, what applies, and if it applies, can you manage it, can you influence, and can you control it? And if you can't, document that you cannot manage, you cannot influence, you cannot control, and then it's going to remain out of your scope. If you can manage, influence, or control, then just recognize that's going to feed into your scope. So that might introduce additional aspects and impacts, that might introduce additional controls, that might introduce additional risk and opportunities. So you're just going to work those through your management system as appropriate for you, and as appropriate for your product, activity, or service, and as appropriate for your management system. Now, I've been mentioning ISO 45001 throughout the program as well, because that's the health and safety management system. And we work with a lot of organizations that have an integrated environmental and health and safety management system that threads together the requirements of ISO 14001 environmental and ISO 45001 health and safety. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that one's also on the horizon of being revised. So ISO is moving forward with changes, and they're currently in that drafting stage with the new standard for 45001 expected roughly 2027. So what we are anticipating, and I'm just saying this for any of you that have an integrated system, if you want to just kind of be on the front end of all of these changes, what we're anticipating for the ISO 45001 is uh, increased awareness of well-being and mental health, recognizing that those psychosocial hazards as core to occupational health and safety. Um, we work with regulations not only within the United States, but some of our stakeholders have organizations in other countries as well. And a lot of the other countries do have some type of psychosocial standard. The United States does not have any type of psychosocial standard under OSHA. So what we are seeing or what we are anticipating with ISO 45001, where it might not be a compliance obligation in the United States relative to psychosocial hazards, there's going to be an increased emphasis in ISO 45001 on those psychosocial issues and hazards such as well-being and mental health. Because we all know, if you're a health and safety professional, we all know if you're distracted, you're going to be more at risk for making a mistake that could lead to a potential health and safety hazard. Um, we're also anticipating emphasis on inclusivity and diversity, specifically as it relates to safety measures and supporting diverse needs. And one way to look at this is, with our training, if somebody has language or literacy barriers, then we need to be able to present the information, the communication, the training, the awareness to meet those diverse needs of any potential language or literacy barriers. So just again, we're expecting those inclusion and diversity as it relates to occupational safety and health. We're anticipating climate emergency readiness, and what we're expecting relative to climate emergency readiness is just to add resilience planning for climate-related disruptions, whether that's so I'm coming to you from South Carolina. So we are still reeling from the effects of Hurricane Helene. That had some significant work-related disruptions from um, that that storm. Was that storm impacted by climate? Maybe, maybe not. But I think we would all agree that we're seeing changing weather patterns and changing weather conditions. And so our emergency preparedness, our readiness, our resilience needs to be able to accommodate those changing weather conditions we might be seeing. And how does it support the resilience of our related occupational safety and health? And then harmonizing the structure and terminology just to align with other ISO standards. So I know that's really high level because we're really in the early stages here, but we are anticipating those changes from ISO 45001. So we're about to wrap up here. So I'll take a peek here in a minute to see if there's been any questions that have been entered thus far. But if you want to go ahead and throw in a question now, just as we kind of tidy up some things. Our next webinar will be in about a month at the end of April, and that's going to be on a regulatory update. So we'll review with you those environmental health and safety related regulations, whether it's from EPA, whether it's from OSHA or similar, that we're tracking, that we're monitoring, and share with you how those might impact your organization. That ties right into ISO 14001, right? Under ISO 14001, clause 6.1.3, or is it now going to be 6.1.2? But on the compliance obligations, you need to make sure that you're staying abreast of regulatory compliance changes. So that April 30 webinar will be right up that alley of those regulatory updates. Also, relative to this topic, ISO 14001, we're anticipating that final standard to be published in 2026, excuse me, in April of 2026. So we are planning on hosting a 1.5-day detailed ISO 14001 training where we will go through clause by clause and what is required, clause by clause, highlighting any of those changes. So once the standard is officially published, we'll have a better timeline for that. But all of you that registered for this webinar, you will get information relative to that training. That one will be a training for a fee as opposed to the complimentary nature like this webinar. But if you participated in this webinar, we'll give you a coupon code so that you're not paying for the full price of that training. So stay tuned for that. We'll have, again, better timeline visibility once the standard is actually published. And then those of you that might be in the Greenville, South Carolina area, we have some in-person training coming up in June relative to RCRA hazardous waste and DOT hazardous material transportation. Our online training is always available. And then I will be sending, when I send out your the email following this with copies of the handouts, I will also give you links to all of our past webinars. We have a webinar hub on YouTube, so you can check out any of our past webinars as well. So with that, here is my contact information. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or comments, beyond today. And oh goodness. So I see that there are questions, but I just got an error message that questions are not available. So let me click this again and see if I can. Okay, here they are. So sometimes you just have to back out and click back in. So we've got a question here. If you are recertifying in 2027, will the expectation be to recertify to this update? You might just have to get off schedule a little bit. You might have to be recertified in 2027, and you might not have the full 3 years in between your next recertification. So the obligation is going to be for you to be recertified at that 3-year mark, which would be 2029. So something, again, that's why we recommended that you have that discussion with your registrar's body if you fall kind of in between that 3-year mark, what's going to make the most sense for you, because there's going to be budget considerations as well, right? So you're probably used to recertification audits every 3 years, surveillance audit every year. You might have to kind of tweak that schedule a little bit to make sure you make that what we're anticipating as the April 2029. You probably can get away with your 2027 recertification standard being to the 2015 one, especially if it's earlier in 2027. But if it's later in 2027, you might want to take a look and see, is there going to be a heavy lift for your organization to update to the standard or not? And if it's going to be a heavy lift, then you might just want to have that conversation with your certifying body to get you a different schedule for that next recertification. So you might be seeing a recertification within 2 years versus within 3 years. Hope that answers that question. So let's see. That is the only question that is showing. But I did get that error when I first clicked in. So if somebody had a question that I'm just not seeing because the teams just decided to go wonky on me for a second, again, my email is right there. My phone number is there as well. Connect with us on all of our platforms. We'll be sure to make a notice when the standard is available. But please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions about the topic today. And we hope to see you at our next webinar on April the 30th as we talk about other regulatory changes that might impact your organization. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.